In this video, we're going to take a look at Lamy Crystal Beryl. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a purple ink, yes, but it's a very magenta leaning, making it kind of confusing in which category I wanted to put it into, and in the end decided to go with purple because that's how most people refer to it online. Now, this ink does give a decent enough amount of shading, but it gives really good color variation depending on the pen that you choose. So if you like its darker tones, you can get those. And if you really like the lighter tones, you can get those as well. So that's really nice about it. It's just this ink doesn't really wow me in any kind of way that makes me want a bottle. Even though I want to say it's a unique-ish kind of tone in that it really dances that line of a magenta or purple, this one's not for me. It leaves me completely whelmed and not looking forward to if I had to refill a pen with this. So while it's nice that I got to use it for a day, I'm kind of happy that the sample is gone so that I don't have to use it for a second day. And that sounds like it's a dig on the ink, but it's not. I've tried a lot of inks, and with that, you get a bit pickier over time. And I can say while it is really nice, I know it's definitely not for me, which leaves me just blah about it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Tasha Spectrum with a music nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it has no feather, no spread. It does offer some shading going on. You can see it in the word graph. You can see it in the word by, in the word markings. I think it shows much nicer where the M is light, the A gets very dark. It lightens up again and then gets very dark at the G. So I think sometimes it shades very well. I'm just not caring for this, but I'm thinking that maybe it's falling towards the idea for me with red, that I know this isn't a red, but I don't care for shading in red. I just don't think I like the shading in this ink. The medium is much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread. There is a little bit of shading that shows up, but that little bit of shading really makes me think about how this ink would look without any shading at all. The broad nib gives no feather, no spread, that same little bit of shading that we got in the medium that again inspires me to really be able to see it without any shading. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very little ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib. A D-like Alpha with a medium nib. A Platinum 3776 with a broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading. I think the tone here looks better than it did on the white paper. I think the cream paper gives it a nicer, softer look and doesn't make the shading as important with it not being there. It's compensated well and I think looks much better. The medium nib is much darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It looks much better than the fine on the page. I can see using it like this without the shading. The broad nib has no feather, no spread, no shading. Its tone is a little bit lighter than what we're getting in the medium. And that little bit lighter is all that it takes for me to not care for that particular tone on this paper. So that's not a good match for me. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting, and we get no bleeding that touches the page underneath. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading. It looks better than it did on the Clairfontaine. It's still not a tone. It's just the tone of it for me that's really not doing this. And really the only place we got to see shading was on the Clairfontaine. So any of the papers that are more absorbent, it quickly goes away. The medium is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, no shading. It's a good solid tone here. Much darker and looks much better than it did in the fine. I can see using it on this paper with a wetter medium pen. The broad nib is a little bit lighter than the medium. Of course, it is a drier broad, so that would happen. There's no feathering. There is no spread. There actually is one or two spots of shading that do show up. You see it on the H of length. You see it on the GH of straight, but not a whole lot. And with that, Seeing that little bit of shading here reminds me that, yeah, I don't like how this one looks as it shades. Looking at the back of the page, we see minor ghosting and no bleeding that touches the page underneath. It's not even coming through.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, this is much lighter and washed out kind of looking, and in fact, it looks kind of pinkish on this paper. So this paper that really does exploit different things in ink brought out some pink here. Now it has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. I don't have any problem reading it. It's not an obnoxious pink on the page, so I actually think for that, it's pretty interesting looking here, and if somebody wanted to add a little bit of pizzazz to their notes, I guess this could be it if you like using these types of notebooks. The medium is much darker and really giving a true tone for this ink. With no feather, no spread, no shading, I do like how it's been looking from the medium, and I think it holds on to those positive characteristics here. Where the broad nib does what it has done, it gets a little bit lighter than the medium and becomes just in that tone I don't care for. Now it has no feather, no spread, no shading. It's perfectly good performance. It's just not the tone for me that I would go for. Looking at the back of the page, we see a very minimal amount of ghosting, and we get no bleed through to the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman number 30. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's David O. Selznick Lilac Wind. Here is Krishna Orchard Lily. Here is Robert Oster Berry Darchi.
The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering. We get no spread. We get no shading. We get kind of a pinkish look to it, kind of a pink magenta-ish look here, more than purple. Not bad. It actually looks kind of nice on this paper. Now, the medium is much darker than the fine. It's got a little bit of feathering going on. You see it in the D of should. You see it on the IBLE of possible in all of 2. I normally don't see a lot of feathering on this particular paper. Here it has it. It's very tiny, really not a big deal. Almost no spread at all, no shading at all, decent tone. The broad is the same tone as the medium. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not shading. So the wet Japanese broad did better than that medium. Looking at the back of the page, now it didn't touch the page underneath at all, so there's no bleeding that corrupts the next page. We do see that it gets very deep into the paper, which naturally leads to a lot of ghosting, but it's overall doing very well here.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a black ink by Califolio Noir. Here is a blue shimmering ink by Diatramentis, Cyan Blue Silver. Here is a blue-black ink by Monteverde, Blue Black. Here is a turquoise ink by Robert Oster, their Deep Sea. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, we get feathering all over. It's tiny, it's manageable, it's not the end of the world, it's not the grossest thing we've ever seen as far as ink's performance. It's actually fairly decent. It does spread, it does not have any shading. It's just kind of there, and we see that kind of pinkish lean here again. The medium is much darker than the fine, bringing back some of its actual color, leaning very purple. It has feathering, yes. It has spread, yes. It doesn't have any shading. I wouldn't call this bad performance considering the paper. The broad nib has feathering, but it's a little more under control than it was with the medium. Again, it is a drier pen. It does have a little bit of spread, and it's not offering any shading, but the tone itself is, as it was, a little bit lighter than it was on other papers, so it's not that tone for me. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that it was getting very deep into the paper. In fact, it came through and dotted the under of the paper a whole lot of times. So that may be, as it would for me, a corrupted page that you don't want to deal with. The ghosting that occurs is a natural byproduct of how deep this ink gets into the page.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
With the shading being nothing special here, it's not something that makes me say, yes, I really want that quality of this ink. More the color I would be more interested in with the right pen. So I'm willing to look for a solid tone out of that ink. For that, I would choose a wet fine or a wet medium pen. Plus, I like the darker tone that it's giving from those wetter pens opposed to the lighter tone. That being said, the word of warning about using that wet pen with this ink if you're on cheaper paper, because it did manage to go quite deep into the page, and you run that risk of corrupting the next page in your notebook, unless it's a composition book.
Thanks for watching.